Welcome to another episode of Into the Remote podcast, the show where we explore the new ways of working and exciting new future of work. Glad to have you with us again. Matus, welcome.
You're right, thank you for having me.
Welcome to our Into the Remote podcast. And I cannot imagine a better person to have for today's topic. Today we're going to be talking about how to build a company culture from scratch. And Matus, we've known each other for quite a few years. We were colleagues at Slido, where you were head of people for about 5 years. And now you are with Powerful Medical, and we're going to be talking about that. So once again, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you.
Cool. So let's dive right in. And culture is an interesting thing, right? Everybody loves to talk about it. And in early days, culture is very often defined by the CEO and the founders, early employees, but things get a little bit more difficult and complicated once the size of the team exceeds, let's say, 30 to 40 people. And with Powerful Medical, you are somewhere beyond that point.
Yeah.
So the first question is, how do you scale culture in a fast-growing team?
Yeah. And maybe to start, usually what happens at the very beginnings is that really the culture is set by the CEO, by the founders. And usually what happens, there's this kind of parent-child effect. And I can say because I now have a 3-year-old child, another on the way. And what happens is that those children try to mimic you in everything what you do, both good and bad. And that's a very similar thing what actually happens also in companies and in startups, is that when more and more people are joining the team, they actually look up to the CEO, they look up to the founders and basically mimic their behavior, the way how they talk to clients, how they make decisions. This is something that actually is happening there. So as we need to pay attention to us as parents, we also need to do that. So in companies, to your question, how to scale culture, it's a $1 billion question probably. So probably not a silver lining, do this and you'll just be fine. But from my experience, I think there are 3 things that kind of work. And the first one is that you should define the culture, and actually 30, 40, maybe a bit too early, but I would say that maybe around 50 to 60 people, that's actually a good time to really codify the culture, who you are. We at Slido, for instance, we had it that the values were set right from the very beginning. I think there was this kind of flip chart from the time where
Absolutely.
There were 4 or 5 people in the office, which actually not much of companies actually have and pay that much attention to it. But really, once you're already 50, 60 people, it's really good to kind of codify the culture, who you are, what is important for you. Second is actually hiring. I think that's the most important thing which you can do is actually hire people. I wouldn't say who are fit into your culture, because that culture will somehow evolve, but who are fit into your values, so that you know that the people are in some ways same thinking and have the same kind of behaviors and values, but then again will enhance the culture in some ways, because culture will change. It's not set in stone. As you evolve, as the company grows, it will evolve. And the third, which is maybe a bit philosophical, is to kind of live those values. And that maybe comes to what I mentioned at the very beginning, is that the culture needs to come at the very beginning, most importantly from the CEO, from the founders. And that's very important, that those people actually live those values in the day-to-day life. Those values get appreciated, celebrated. You make sure that people receive feedback based on if they actually live those values, or they do make decisions based on their values, or actually they receive negative feedback if actually some behavior is actually not in line with the values.
Got it. I would like to elaborate on that point, a very interesting point that you made earlier about children mimicking their parents, right? And if you have a small team of early employees or co-founders, they mimic each other, or they mimic their leader. But again, there is this threshold, whether it's 30 to 60 people that we discussed. You might not be in touch with the CEO or founders so closely, right?
Yeah. And that's actually the problem where it arises, that you don't see that CEO on a day-to-day basis, because usually those people interact on a day-to-day basis. They see or interact with the CEO all the time. But at that certain size, it's no longer there.
Exactly. So how do you scale it, right? I would like to dig deeper over here.
Yeah.
So you've got a team of 50 plus people.
Yeah.
Let's say 80% of them are not interacting with the CEO anymore on a daily basis. How do you scale it? How do you make sure that it cascades to other levels?
Yeah. So for instance, what we did in Slido, I think was very, very important, is that really like the founders set the really like strong foundation for the culture and for the values that was there. But then it became tricky at that certain size of the company. And going back to those three things that I mentioned, like the first thing is to kind of codify the culture. So what we did was that, yes, we had those three values that people somehow would remember. But we kind of made this document like who we are. We kind of expanded on those values, and we drafted of what it actually means to live those three values. And I think this is something important. I mean, there are famous examples of Netflix building their culture code, which many people regarded as one of the most important documents, which was created in Silicon Valley and so on. And many other companies have this guidebooks, employee handbooks that are basically handed over to new employees during their onboarding and so on. So this is really important, I think. And really, for the founders, it can be tricky and difficult to kind of talk about these things all over again. But I think this is actually one of the things that you should actually stress and mention during your all hands meetings, during your offsites, and basically during the times where the company gathers around to actually meet together. But also really like to highlight the behaviors that support the culture, saying and giving a shout out that, hey, you right here just held a meeting with the customer, and this is the behavior that he or she presented, and I think this is actually in line with the values. So really give them like a kudos or something like that, so people know that okay, so if I behave this certain way, that is actually
appreciated.
Because the values should actually reflect a way that, okay, if I behave in this behavior, this is how we as a company will become successful.
And again, you touched on an interesting point over here. So culture should be lived, shouldn't be just documented, codified, or whatever we call it. So how do you build those rituals when there are none?
Yeah, and that's actually the problem, that at this moment, all of companies have their values or like who we are somewhere written. Unfortunately, in most of those companies, it's just some kind of like golden letters, just written on top of the reception. And unfortunately, it just stays there. So it's really important to kind of live those values on a day-to-day life. And again, coming back to the parent-child kind of example, is that number one thing what you can do is really, as a leader, live by example. And the values actually come from you. Like all the companies actually, they already have the values, even if they haven't like codified them. Like values are not something like, okay, this is something what I would want to be, or this, like it should they should be aspirational in some way. Like we don't need to be 100% in all of them. But I would say that the values are already there. Like every company has their values. It comes from the founders, from the early team members. So really just, so for them it comes natural. Like this is the way how we operate. This is the way how we work. This is the way how we give each other feedback, how we make decisions on the product and so on. So they should come naturally. So it's important really that you live them as the founder, and by that it basically gets basically transcended to the next level. And to be specific, then like really to then hire the people that will be fit into those values. So obviously we'll need to look for people who are also like from a skill base, fit into your company for those specific roles, because obviously you have some kind of business need where you have a gap, so you need to hire somebody for that. But I would say that the ticket to entry should be actually those kind of fit into the values. And one thing is hiring the people which are fit into your culture, but it goes hand in hand with actually saying goodbye to people that might not be fit into the values, which obviously you can have. And I would suggest and advise everyone to have a really like a high bar when it comes to hiring, like really not to go below, even though you have that need and the business requires to have that role filled as soon as possible. But really don't go below the bar. It never pays off. And even from our experiences, it was that we were kind of unsure about a person, but we really needed that role to be filled. So we made a decision to hire them. And after a couple of weeks, after a couple of months, we actually had to say goodbye. And the time and every energy and resources it took obviously were way much more than if we would be waiting. But then again, like companies maybe sometimes are hesitant to pull the plug on people who are possibly like great performers, but are not in line with the culture. And that's something that will more importantly in that small team, it will just like corrupt the whole environment.
So actually, just to sum it up, what you said. So hiring the like-minded people or the people with the right values or with matching values is important. Then leading by example, and then third, appreciating publicly all those small gestures and the lived values, and encouraging
and making small things like, okay, so we actually decided to introduce this new feature because we believe that it will do this or that, and we believe, and maybe say that this like out loud, like, and it's in line with this or that value that we have here.
Got it.
Or we're actually doing this kind of initiative because this or that value. And again, for the founders, they might be already sick of it because like, okay, we're mentioning all the time, but honestly, you can, like for me, values, culture, some of the things that you can never mention enough.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the importance of documenting and codifying culture. I see this more important even now with the remote teams when other employees and people don't get the chance to mimic that behavior, coming back to your earlier point. What's your take on that?
So super important. Like when it comes to remote people who, and this will come a challenge that they won't see the founding team on a day-to-day basis, or they maybe won't see them for the first couple of months whatsoever, to really get the chance to experience the culture. So what we did in Slido, what we're actually doing now in Power for Medical as well, is that we try to fly everyone to the headquarters for their actually first couple of days in the office, so that they get a chance to experience the culture firsthand. So even though they will be working remotely, they will maybe have zero contact with like physical contact with other team members, they will at least have that experience at the very, very beginning of their employment, to experience the people and everything. Another thing what we did is that, and again, both in Slido, both in Power for Medical, is that we have actually a session about who we are, about the history of the company, about the culture, like why we are actually doing the things which we are doing, because I think it's very important to kind of get this understanding of the why at the very beginning of your experience, because then you can somehow connect the dots and see that, okay, now I see why our CEO made this decision maybe some years back, and okay, that actually inspires me to do similar.
So flying people from all across Europe or world is actually not an expense, but investment in the team.
It's a huge expense, but again, learning from our experiences, I totally can recall some examples of when we actually didn't do this. So we didn't flew the people because of some limitations, or they had to already start working, which is usually the case, and that's going to be the pushback from the business that, okay, come on, I can't give you the person for like an onboarding for like a week or two. I really need them to start working right away.
You want to rush it, right?
This happened to us numerous times, and actually I can really point to those examples that we have seen it, and after 1 or 2 months that the person was lacking something, and it's very tough to kind of catch up on those kind of culture things once the person is already like inside the work and already hustling on the project or whatever. But really, as you said, it's an expense, and obviously it is an expense of flying, hotels, whatever, logistics, both in terms of money, but in terms of timing. Usually when somebody needs somebody, it's like, okay, like yesterday was already too late, but it's a huge investment.
And it pays off.
It's a huge things, that it pays off.
Got it. So what is your current remote setup at Powerful? How would you describe the environment you work with? Are you fully are you fully remote? Are you hybrid? What is it?
So currently, I would say that we have a strong presence in our headquarters in Slovakia, where the majority of the team is based. Then about like a quarter of the company is actually remote.
Yeah.
And most of those people are just single people based in those locations. Most of them are actually people from the commercial team, so salespeople. But also we have a couple of engineering, so tech people distributed. And for me, it's something that is inevitable. Like, it's not like we made the decision to, okay, let's go remote. I believe that it's inevitable, both in terms of that you need to be able to be present in various countries to be able to address those markets. So business decision that you want to be there, and obviously you won't hire 5 people in the same location out of one. So like usually you will start with 1 or 2 people. And the second is the talent scarcity. Like, honestly, if you're based in one location, then 99% of the global talent is not based in that location or is not planning to be actually relocated to that location. So I believe that remote work in today's world is inevitable. And obviously, we as a young company, as we were not founded as a remote first company, because there are also companies who do this, that right from the beginning, we are remote first. Even if we are on the same location, we work either from home, cafes, co-working spaces, or whatever. But this was not the case. In Powerful Medical, it was the case, and also actually similar to Slido, there was people
in early years.
In early years, it was that a bunch of people who already knew themselves from previous projects were there, actually sitting in one room, which at the end of the day actually makes it complicated, because then you need to make the shift from actually for everyone being basically in the same room, meaning that internal communication happens that, hey, Uri, what do you think about this? You
Exactly.
just turn on one chair and that's internal communication, to the setup that, okay, actually there's not all of us are sitting in the same room. So if we make a decision or anything like that, then obviously that needs to be communicated to the other people.
Well, I experienced this setup. We called it like a remote friendly,
Yeah.
and we worked in a very similar fashion in the early years.
Yeah.
80% of people were located in the HQ and roughly 20% globally. And it had its own challenges, right? So, and Matus, you just said that you are hiring both locally as well as globally. How do you make sure that you are not creating two different types of experiences for your employees?
It's a tough one. And I don't think you can be like 100%, like that it's going to be like the same experience and everything. Like, there are going to be nuances which unfortunately cannot be replicable. Then again, what I'm already thinking and kind of working strongly is that those remote people won't become like second citizens in some kind of way. Mm-hmm. So that, and this comes to anything that you do basically, when it comes to how you run meetings, how the compensation is built up, or like if you have some kind of benefits that only people in the headquarters can actually use. But what I try to do, and again, like in Powerful Medical, definitely we have a long way to go, but already have this to keep them in mind and basically build these things from scratch, making sure that you keep those remote people in mind, because we know that as we grow, actually the percentage of people working remotely or basically outside of our like central offices will be actually bigger and higher.
Mm-hmm. And I think internal communication is difficult in particular. And you just mentioned an example. You just turn to your colleague and you ask them a question.
Yeah.
How do you tackle this challenge at Powerful Medical? I mean, internal communication, knowledge base.
Yeah.
How do you make sure that people have equal access
Yeah.
to information that are critical for their jobs?
Yeah. I believe that COVID has taught us a lot, that things that we thought that couldn't be done previously are actually possible, because again, it was just necessity because that was the situation. I believe that in all the aspects, and this also comes to like leadership in general, you need to be way much more deliberate in those things.
Intentional, right?
Intentional, exactly. So meaning, if internal communication when everybody was in the same room just happened, when it comes to having people remotely, you need to actually think about it, and you need to be like, okay, so what does it mean that we are having an all-hands meeting and not everyone will be in the same room? What does it mean, basically, if somebody is connecting from the UK, from Germany, as actually that's our case at the moment. And somebody needs to actually take care of it and think about it. When you're 30, 40 people, usually that's the time when you hire your first people person. Usually then it's their responsibility. But even sooner, somebody needs to be there, like to be the kind of champion of the remote people. So that's one thing. Also, when it comes to like knowledge base and everything, in Powerful Medical, we have a big advantage because we are a healthcare startup, and we are in a highly regulated environment. So actually, the regulation in this is actually a positive thing, because it somehow pushes us to document everything what we do. What it means is that all things related to engineering, to product, but also when it comes to internal operations need to be documented, which actually is then by design remote friendly, because obviously we use Notion, for instance, and honestly I haven't seen such a Notion in my life, what we have in Powerful Medical, and we're a company of 50 people and early stage startup, and the Notion which we have is out of the world. Like, organized, information there, like linked through various tools. Like, it blew my mind when I've seen it. And honestly, and it was unintentionally done, but it really helps when it comes to now when we're becoming more and more remote, because those people then can really like find those information, and becomes the single point of truth, and basically all the things that are happening in the company are then referenced, for instance, to Notion, and it helps tremendously in this whole thing.
Do you see a correlation between scaling the culture and documenting things? Do you see that there is a link between the two?
I think it helps tremendously. Like I said, I mean, when you're a small team, I mean, you really don't bother usually of actually writing down like who we are, but actually, like, when you lose touch with the people, meaning like you as the CEO or the founder don't have a day-to-day contact with those people, then actually you need to put it somewhere where those people can actually look for it and have that understanding of that. So really, like, what we did, like very practically, we actually built a slides deck about it, where it actually we went deeper, and that slides deck was then uploaded to our kind of internal wiki. And for instance, in Power of Medical, it's that Notion page where people can actually go through, and we recommend people as part of the onboarding. So actually, everybody goes for it.
They go through all that information that is stored in that single source of truth.
Exactly. And it has like steps. Okay, so like during this session, you look at this, videos and everything, and it's basically stored over there.
Well, documentation is asynchronous communication to a large extent. Let's talk now about synchronous communication, meaning meetings. What role do meetings play in keeping the culture alive from your perspective? Are they a friend or a foe?
Can be both, obviously. I think it's like it can be a huge, and it is a huge friend in a way that you can use it to scale and expand the culture, because meetings are the place where actually multiple people meet. And I believe that then that's somehow where the culture can be reinforced, where you have a chance. And I would really strongly encourage companies to have regular meetings for all their people, having regular all hands meetings. I would suggest to go for like a regular cadence every month. Worked for many of the companies that I worked for, and basically having a meeting where you kind of look back and then kind of align everyone for the future. And especially when it comes to remote people, making them actually remote friendly in a way that people can join, can have a voice in those meetings. So it's not that, hey, everyone in the room, but also like, hey, welcoming people remotely, giving them a chance to voice any questions, or if you're asking some questions to the audience, so towards that. But also when it comes to having regular offsites, some companies have it like once, twice a year. And again, it's a huge investment if you would want to fly everyone to the same location.
Absolutely.
But I would say in a company under 100 people, it's a no-brainer of doing it. Like, again, like this is something which people get connected, and where the culture can be lived and expanded. And even for people who had no chance of interacting with people, like it helped us so much in the previous experiences. And also in Power of Medical, we had one in May. Like for us, it was, we then lived with it and from the experiences there for months onwards. And so a huge fan of these kind of connecting people during all hands, offsites, and so on.
Awesome. In the previous podcast, we had Peter Fabor from ServOffice, and he organized over 400 company retreats for remote companies, and he's a huge advocate of meeting in person. And very often in such a case, he's a huge proponent of socializing activities over discussing strategy and stuff like that. That can be done over email, Slack, or whatever, over Zoom, but that connection that comes from human to human, that's very, very unique.
Because I think what I think it happened also during COVID, actually, that what many people said is that many of the jobs that they had became just a job.
Right.
Without that kind of connection, without that kind of culture element. Because at the end of the day, what culture does is, I think it amplifies the things what you do. Like if you can do like a certain output of yours to the culture, that can be actually doubled, tripled in a way, because you bring yourself in, your whole self into it, and the enthusiasm and everything. Without that, it kind of lacks the energy, the spirit, and everything, and it somehow becomes just a job.
Got it. So offsites, all hands meetings are critical.
Yeah.
What about meetings that happen on a regular basis, let's say on a weekly basis? Do you think it's important that leaders create space and create meetings that revolve solely around informal communication and socializing to enforce that culture?
So this is again like what I think happened during COVID, is that at the big, like, people didn't need to kind of pay more attention to this, like be deliberate about it, because those kind of informal chats happened in the corridors, in the kitchen while drinking coffee or whatever. But during COVID, it was for all people around the world. For remote companies, that was just basically the case, is how they operate. So yeah, exactly, like people, and again, like coming back to the thought, you need to pay more and extra attention to make sure that there's also this kind of social part of it, that it's not just kind of work, but it's also this kind of human element in this. And actually, there are numerous researches done behind it, and researchers that back this by data, that actually companies and teams where there is also this kind of human and culture element present, they actually outperform teams that are only there, like, come there, put on my headphones and start working, and then, that's it. But also when there is this kind of interaction and everything, I'm a strong believer in this, yeah.
Got it. So we're talking about knowledge base, we're talking about meetings. What about those chat platforms, such as, or communication platforms in general, such as Slack? At Slido, we had the special, Slack channels dedicated to certain areas of our culture. For example, we had a channel labeled "Thank You," where the team could give a shout out to people who went an extra mile and appreciate their hard work. Or we had that random channel where we posted all sorts of memes and everybody was laughing. It was the #1 channel for the whole company, and those were the places where
you can see that people actually check out the messages sooner on random than on general.
Exactly. So those were the places on Slack where our culture was lived. What about Powerful Medical? Do you have any Slack channels where your culture is lived?
Yeah, and I think like a thank you channel, which we also have, is a nice example, because then you can actually appreciate the things that are in line with your culture. And I mean, we as human beings, we want to be appreciated. So it actually triggers this sense in your brain that, oh wow, if I got appreciated for this, obviously I'm going to do it next time. And if I seen that somebody else was appreciated for something like this, I'm going to probably follow the example, right? So I mean, it's common sense. And yeah, like Slack is a huge enabler in this, because yes, like you have some stories lived, and then an emoji is created out of a story. So even if you weren't part of that, you can then ask, so can you give me some story behind this kind of custom made emoji? And that's where the stories and everything is again relived, and maybe not so important when there's 20-30 of you, because everybody knows about everything. But again, as your team grows, as your team scales, as you become more remote, this becomes even more and more important. Then again, it can also be like you will need to, for instance, we have this channel which is around like exercising and so on. And for some people, it can be a kind of like a fear of missing out in a way, because obviously people go after work to hang out together, and that's something what was happening, I believe, in Slido, in a way that there were many activities done around the headquarters, around the main office, and obviously people outside were just seeing posts and some photos on Slack, and we're like, well, I'm a bit like sad that I can't be part of it.
So how do you tackle this challenge?
So again, when thinking about the activities, I mean, I wouldn't say that scrape all the activities where the remote people can't join, but actually pay special attention to make activities that also the remote people can join in. And possibly what we started doing is that we actually started having offsites for specific teams that were, for instance, remote, that they had an offsite just for themselves. Or you can actually have an extra budget for some activities that they can do that. If you order some food for your main office, because that's so easy to do, then to have some kind of budget or allowance for people who are remote, that hey, they can order some kind of takeaway and actually then join in the party or something like that.
Actually, it was one of my most favorite gestures that Slido did for us as employees.
Yeah.
Whether for those 20% that were working remotely, that they were reimbursed.
Yeah.
That pizza or whatever sushi that you ordered on company's expense, or later on when we worked in a fully remote setup and we had a fully remote, let's say, offsite or all hands, and then Peter, our CEO, and he just let us know that, okay, go ahead and just order something up to a certain amount. I think it was a really, really nice gesture, and I think these rather small gestures can go really a long way, especially showing the remote employees and remote team members that, okay, you are appreciated, we see you, we hear you, and we think of you.
And it can be like small things like company merch, like obviously it arrives in the office, so you hand it out to people who are there, but then you need to think about those people that aren't there and actually go ahead and actually send it to them. And I received then tons of messages of like, wow, that's amazing, it just arrived in the mail, and actually nowadays receiving something physical from like, it's amazing.
Cool. Well, second to last question, Matus, for you. Culture is very much a thing that is alive, right? How do you measure it? In other words, do you use any employee barometers on a regular basis at Powerful Medical? And if so, how do you work with them?
Yeah, sure. Maybe to the question that you just mentioned before regarding that the culture evolves. This is something which you really need to kind of have in your mind and basically set your expectations right, that the culture will eventually change, because this is something that might disturb maybe the early team members, that you will hear those it's not how it was in the early days and so on. But like the culture will evolve. That's a natural state, and it evolves because we are growing as a company. We want to be successful. We want to offer the product to more people, to more clients. Therefore, we need more employees. So the culture will evolve. It's not set in stone. But to your question, yes. So what we do is we do actually regular employee surveys.
How often?
We do every second month. We do like a short pulse check.
Okay.
It has 5 to 6 rating questions where I have like most important things which are important for me, meaning like how do you feel, how is the workload, how if that person feels as an important part of the team, if they're learning, if they see that they're growing as individuals, as professionals, and most importantly, I ask the ENPS, the Employee Net Promoter Score question of how likely are you to recommend Powerful Medical as an employer. So we measure this on a monthly cadence. Also, I have there one open question of like, if you can change one thing, what would it be? What would make your life at Powerful Medical easier? And then every 6 months, I send out a longer barometer, which has more questions. Usually the pulse check, you can fill it out in like 3-4 minutes. The barometer is a longer one, maybe like 15 minutes. And that's something where I go deeper, from which I actually take, okay, so these are the main things that we need to work on as the people team, as the company, as the leaders. So that creates then the roadmap for us. The pulse checks are, as it comes from the name, just to monitor if the pulse of the company is okay and if we're going the right direction, or we need to kind of do some steering.
You just mentioned the roadmap. How do you work with these results afterwards?
So we obviously evaluate it. We compare it to previous results. We have some benchmarks of where we are aiming. We see what, like, just looking at it, analyzing, you see like, okay, this is somewhere where we dropped, or this is somewhere where we actually made some progress. So based on that, you should actually set some kind of results, set yourself some goals in the direction, because maybe out of that it will come that, okay, we actually need to work on our compensation. Maybe we need to work on our hiring. So it really sets the direction of what the people team leadership company should work on. But what's very important for me is also the kind of open text questions. So again, from the pulse check, I usually ask 1 or 2 open-ended questions. In the barometer, I'm asking multiple ones. And from there, I analyze it, look for patterns, try to group those questions. And if I see that there's some issues with misalignment, that it comes that, okay, I'm not clear on the strategy, or we're up to as a company, okay, this is something that we need to start thinking about. And actually it comes with a remote, possibly, like how to, and again, I also try to make sure that I understand from where it's coming from. Again, depends on the size of the company. Like when there's 30 of you, probably don't need to do that. But maybe from like 50, 60 people, you can actually then ask questions like, in what region are you based, or what is the function of your team? So you can see that, okay, this is actually coming from the remote people, that they're having this kind of common issues. I probably should address them.
Yeah. That's a good point. You might want to segment the insights based on a certain category.
I wouldn't overkill it. Overkill it from the very beginning. Then again, it's your question if you want to do it anonymous, or if you actually want them people to sign in. When doing anonymous, obviously when you have one person working remotely and they choose, working remotely, go fish.
These strategies, they both have their pros and cons.
So common sense is important.
Absolutely. A very quick question: what tool are you using to run your pulse checks?
We're using simple Google spreadsheets,
Google
Forms.
Google Forms, okay, and then import it to Google Sheets.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, got it. And the very last question, culture and the company culture is such a huge topic. And Matus, I know that you are an avid reader and you create your top books for each year. So I would like to ask you the last question, which is, what are your top 3 books on culture that you've read?
Top 3 ones. It will be a tough one, but if anybody would want to discuss, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to discuss this topic. It's my favorite one. One of the first books I read was actually Delivering Happiness by Tony Hsieh.
Yeah.
And they had a very special culture in Zappos, exactly. And it's a very open and honest book about company culture. So that was one of the first ones I read on it. So it's dear to me. The second one is quite recent and really it was rated one of the top business books and so on. I think it was from 2 years back, from Reed Hastings from Netflix, as regarded as one of the top company cultures, high regarded in many ways. So he wrote a book, No Rules, about their culture of no rules and how it actually works. So it's very interesting because
that's a good one.
Because obviously you cannot take it as it is and trying to implement it. That never works in culture as such. But I believe there are many things where people can get inspired. And the third one, it doesn't go exactly in company culture, but I really like Black Box Thinking by Matus Horvath, which is a book about how to create culture of feedback. And what he said is that actually he compares there's, for instance, the aviatory and how we have actually very limited accidents when it comes to airplanes. And that's because when something doesn't go well, if somebody makes a mistake, they actually sunshine their mistake and they actually write reports on it, and that actually goes with remote culture that is being documented. It's being shared with pilots all over the world, and that's why actually then aviation is one of the safest industries out there. So that's a good one.
Got it.
Recommend.
Matus, if somebody wants to get in touch with you and discuss culture and whatnot, how can they connect with you?
They could probably look me up on LinkedIn, send me a message. We'll be looking forward to having a chat or whatever.
Matus, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Ray, again. Good luck with everything.
Thanks.